I used to believe that every meaningful thing announced itself, that if something had the power to change you, you would recognize it the moment it arrived. There would be a clear beginning, a defining conversation, a moment you could point to years later and say, that was where everything shifted. I don't believe that anymore. Some things don't arrive loudly enough to be remembered. They don't interrupt your life. They simply enter it so naturally that your mind mistakes them for something that has always been there. You don't notice them at first because they don't demand attention. They earn it without trying. That's what happened to me. If someone asked when this started, I couldn't answer them honestly. I could invent a memory. I could choose a conversation or a passing moment and pretend it began there. But that wouldn't be true. The truth is much stranger. There was never a beginning I could see, only a point where I realized something inside me had already changed. I've spent most of my life believing that understanding people was simply a matter of observation. Watch long enough, listen carefully enough, eventually everyone reveals themselves, not because they want to, because no one can maintain a performance forever. Every person becomes transparent eventually. Fear leaves fingerprints. Hope changes the rhythm of a voice. Loneliness hides inside the words people repeat too often. Confidence always carries a shadow if you know where to look. I became very good at seeing those things, almost too good. It taught me something I never expected. Most people aren't hiding who they are, they're hiding from themselves. They spend years building identities that feel safe, convincing themselves those identities are real simply because they've repeated them long enough. They mistake habit for personality, comfort for truth, approval for purpose. And after watching that happen again and again, something in me quietly stepped back, not because I disliked people, because I stopped expecting honesty. Not the kind people tell others, the kind they tell themselves. Eventually, distance became natural, not physical distance, tonal distance. I could sit beside someone for hours while remaining completely untouched by their presence. Conversations happened, laughter happened, life continued. But none of it reached the place inside me where things actually mattered. I accepted that. In fact, I preferred it. Distance creates clarity. When people stay far enough away, they can't accidentally reshape parts of you that took years to understand. I protected that clarity carefully, not with walls. Walls are obvious. People notice walls. I used something quieter, availability without exposure, presence without access. People believed they knew me because I answered their questions. They never realized the answers they received were true, just never complete. There's a difference, a dangerous difference. You can tell the truth while revealing almost nothing. Very few people notice, and the ones who don't notice usually believe they're closer than they actually are. That illusion kept everything simple, predictable, until something happened that didn't follow any pattern I understood. It wasn't dramatic, no unforgettable conversation, no emotional confession, no life-changing event. Just a strange feeling that appeared without explanation. The feeling that someone wasn't looking at the version of me I presented. They were somehow aware of the version I never introduced. That should have been impossible. Not because I'm impossible to understand, because understanding requires information, time, experience, jarred history. None of those things existed, yet somehow certainty did. At first I questioned myself. Maybe I was imagining it. The human mind loves creating stories from coincidence. It connects unrelated moments until they feel meaningful. I told myself that's all this was. A misunderstanding dressed up as intuition, but intuition has a strange habit. When it's false, it fades. When it's true, it becomes quieter, sharper, less emotional, almost mathematical. And this feeling kept becoming more precise. I began noticing things I had ignored before. Not grand gestures, tiny moments. The kind most people forget seconds after they happen. The pause before a sentence, the expression that appears for less than a heartbeat. The silence after a question instead of the answer itself. Most communication happens there, between words, not inside them. Very few people pay attention to those spaces. Even fewer understand them. You did. Without trying, without making a performance out of being observant, that was unusual. People who notice too much often want recognition for it. They mention every detail they discover. They enjoy proving how perceptive they are. You never did. You noticed quietly, almost as if observation wasn't something you practiced. It was simply how you existed. That unsettled me more than I expected, because people who observe silently don't collect information, they absorb it. There's a difference. Information stays separate from the person collecting it. Understanding becomes part of them. And somehow, it felt as though you understood things I hadn't fully understood about myself. I resisted that thought immediately, not because it frightened me, because it challenged something fundamental. I've always believed self-awareness is earned through solitude. You spend enough time alone with your own thoughts, eventually you begin recognizing your own patterns. No one else can do that work for you, or at least that's what I believed. Then I met someone who reflected parts of me I hadn't yet learned to describe, not by explaining them, by naturally responding to them. There's something profoundly disorienting about being understood before you've finished understanding yourself. It creates a silence inside your mind, not confusion, recognition, the kind that doesn't arrive as a sentence. It arrives as stillness, like two pieces finally fitting together after years of existing separately. I didn't trust that feeling, not because it seemed impossible, because it seemed too effortless. Everything important in life usually demands struggle. Relationships require work. Trust requires time. Understanding requires patience. But this, this seemed to ignore every rule I had accepted. Nothing was forced. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing asked for permission. Awareness simply continued expanding, quietly, batly, without ever announcing itself. I kept waiting for the illusion to break. Every unusual connection eventually reveals its weakness. Someone misunderstands something, expectations collide, reality replaces imagination. That's how these stories usually end. So I waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became longer stretches of ordinary life. Still, nothing fractured. Instead, small confirmations kept appearing. Not enough to prove anything, just enough to prevent me from dismissing it. One sentence arriving exactly when I needed perspective. One shared silence carrying more meaning than an hour of conversation. One ordinary interaction somehow remaining in my thoughts far longer than logic could justify. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. Patterns. Life hides inside patterns. Single moments lie. Repeated moments tell the truth. I realized I wasn't paying attention because I wanted this connection to exist. I was paying attention because reality kept presenting evidence that something unusual already did. That realization changed the questions I asked myself. Instead of wondering whether this was real. I began wondering why it felt so familiar, not familiar in the sense of shared memories deeper than that. Like recognizing a melody you've never heard before. Somehow it already belongs to you. You don't learn it. You remember it. That feeling stayed with me. I couldn't explain it. Every logical explanation felt incomplete. Coincidence became statistically unlikely. Projection didn't fit because I wasn't imagining qualities that weren't there. Wishful thinking made even less sense because I hadn't been searching for any of this. If anything, I'd spent years ensuring nothing like this could happen. And yet, here it was, existing without my permission. I've always believed control begins with awareness. If you understand something clearly enough, you decide how much influence it has over your life. That's always been my philosophy. Observe first, understand completely, then choose. But this reversed the order. Influence arrived before explanation. Meaning appeared before language. By the time I understood something was changing, it already had. That's what troubled me, not the connection itself. The fact that it bypassed every system I'd built for recognizing change before it reached me. It slipped past every habit, every defense, every carefully constructed distance. Not because it was stronger than them, because it never challenged them. Water doesn't defeat stone by attacking it. It simply keeps flowing until one day the landscape looks different. No dramatic battle ever happened. Only quiet transformation. That's exactly how this felt. I kept trying to locate the moment where I could have stopped it. There wasn't one. Every individual step seemed harmless, completely ordinary. Only when I looked backward did I realize how far everything had already moved. Perspective is strange that way. It rarely exists while something is happening. It arrives afterward, carrying answers that would have changed everything if they'd appeared sooner. Maybe that's why so many people misunderstand their own lives. They're searching for turning points. Life prefers gradual shifts. One unnoticed decision, one unexpected conversation, one person entering your awareness so naturally that you don't realize they've changed the architecture of your inner world until months later. I wonder how often that happens. How many lives quietly transform without anyone recognizing the exact moment they began becoming someone different? Maybe change was never supposed to feel dramatic. Maybe the deepest transformations happen too gently to notice. Maybe certainty doesn't arrive like lightning. Maybe it arrives like sunrise, so slowly that darkness disappears before you realize light has taken its place. And maybe that's why I've struggled to explain any of this. Not because I lack words, because words were designed to describe events. This wasn't an event. It was a gradual rearrangement of perception, a quiet recalibration of something invisible. Nothing outside my life looked different. The same routines continued, the same responsibilities remained, the same ordinary days came and went. But internally, the map had changed, without warning, without permission, without asking whether I was ready for it, and somewhere between who I had been and whoever I was becoming, I realized one truth I could no longer avoid. Some people don't enter your life to become another chapter. They arrive to quietly rewrite the language you've been using to understand yourself all along. And once that language changes, every thought that follows begins speaking differently. For a while, I convinced myself that nothing significant was happening, that whatever had shifted inside me would eventually return to its original place. After all, every unusual feeling has a way of fading if you refuse to feed it. Attention gives things power. Distance takes that power away. At least that's what I had always believed. So I stopped looking for evidence. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped analyzing the moments that lingered longer than they should. I gave my mind every opportunity to move on. It didn't. Instead, something unexpected happened. The less I focused on you, the more naturally you became part of the way I experienced everything else. It wasn't obsession. Obsession is loud. It interrupts. It demands constant attention until it exhausts you. This wasn't like that. This was quiet enough to hide inside ordinary life. I would notice something beautiful and instinctively wonder how you would interpret it. Not because I needed your opinion, because I had started trusting the way you saw the world. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Trust isn't something I hand to people. It's something I slowly build from repeated evidence. Even then, I keep part of myself untouched. Not out of fear, out of respect for the person I've spent years becoming. Your inner world deserves protection. Not everyone who enters it understands what they're carrying. Some people leave fingerprints where they should have left nothing. Others leave questions you'll spend years answering. I've seen it happen. I've watched people lose themselves trying to become understandable to someone who was never truly listening. I promised myself I would never make that mistake. If someone wanted to know me, they would have to meet me where I actually existed, not where they imagined I should. Most people never reach that place. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't know it existed. They mistook conversation for connection, agreement for understanding, attention for presence. Those things look similar from the outside. They're not. Real presence is strangely rare. It doesn't rush to solve you. It doesn't interrupt your thoughts with its own. It doesn't constantly search for something clever to say. It simply stays without needing to prove its value. That kind of presence changes people, not dramatically, patently, like rain softening stone, one quiet season at a time. The strange part is that I didn't notice myself becoming more open. I noticed myself becoming less guarded. Those aren't the same thing. Being open means revealing more. Being less guarded means no longer feeling the need to hide what was already there. There's an important difference. One is effort, the other is relief. And relief has a way of exposing truths you've carried for years without realizing how heavy they were. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. When was the last time I felt completely understood without having to explain myself? I searched through memories. Faces appeared. Voices returned. Conversations I once believed mattered floated back into my mind, yet something was missing from all of them. They remembered what I said. Very few remembered who I was while saying it. People often hear your words. They rarely hear the silence underneath them. You did. You noticed the pauses I never intended anyone to notice. Not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. Sometimes silence reveals more than language ever could. Words are edited before they're spoken. Silence isn't. It appears exactly as it exists. Raw, unprotected, complete. That's why it frightened me when I realized you understood mine. Not every silence means the same thing. Some carry peace, others carry exhaustion. Some hide disappointment so quietly that even the person feeling it can't describe it. You never confused one with another. That level of accuracy shouldn't have been possible. I searched for an explanation. Maybe we simply thought alike. Maybe our experiences had shaped us in similar ways. Maybe we were projecting ourselves onto each other without realizing it. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None of them felt complete, because similarity alone doesn't create recognition. Plenty of people think similarly. Very few make you feel seen. There's a difference between sharing opinions and sharing perception. Opinions belong to the surface. Perception shapes everything underneath. Two people can disagree about almost everything while still understanding each other completely. And two people can agree about everything while remaining strangers forever. Understanding doesn't come from matching conclusions. It comes from recognizing how another mind arrives there. That's what fascinated me. You didn't just understand what I believed. You understood why. Even when I never explained it, that shouldn't have been possible. There were moments when I'd begin forming a thought, but stop halfway, deciding it wasn't worth saying aloud. Then, somehow, the conversation would drift toward exactly that place anyway. Not because you forced it, because you naturally arrived there. Almost as if we had been walking different roads toward the same destination without realizing it. I began wondering how many invisible connections exist between people. How many remain unnoticed because everyone is too busy speaking to observe what's happening underneath the conversation. Perhaps the deepest relationships aren't built from talking more. Perhaps they're built from needing to explain less. That idea stayed with me long after every conversation ended, long after ordinary life resumed its familiar rhythm. It lingered quietly in the background, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. What if understanding isn't created? What if it's recognized? What if the people who change us most aren't the ones who teach us something new, but the ones who reveal something we've quietly known all along? The thought refused to leave. Neither did you. Not physically, mentally, emotionally, structurally. You became part of the lens through which I examined everything else, without trying, without asking, without even knowing it was happening. That's what made it impossible to dismiss. If this had been driven by excitement, it would have faded. Excitement always burns quickly. This didn't burn. It settled. Like roots, finding soil they didn't know was waiting for them. One evening I caught myself smiling at a thought, not because it was particularly joyful, because I instinctively imagined how you would have understood it without me explaining why it mattered. The smile disappeared almost immediately, not from embarrassment, from realization. I had stopped translating my thoughts in my imagination. For years, every conversation inside my own mind involved explanation. If I imagined telling someone something important, I automatically imagined clarifying every layer, every meaning, every possibility of misunderstanding. With you, that habit quietly vanished. Somewhere along the way, my mind had stopped preparing explanations. It simply assumed understanding. That assumption changed everything. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed because I knew how much energy I had spent my entire life making sure people interpreted me correctly. Suddenly, that effort felt unnecessary. Not because misunderstanding became impossible, because I no longer expected it from you. Trust isn't always a decision. Sometimes it's a pattern your mind recognizes before your heart catches up. Deepest decisions are made quietly, by parts of us we don't fully understand, long before consciousness arrives to explain them. If that's true, then perhaps I had already answered questions I was still pretending to ask. That possibility stayed with me. Some truths don't arrive as certainty. They arrive as the absence of resistance, and I realized something that stopped me completely. I wasn't trying to protect myself from you anymore. I was simply being myself. The difference is almost invisible, yet it changes everything. Protection requires constant awareness. Authenticity forgets to monitor itself. I couldn't remember the last time I had forgotten to monitor myself around anyone. Maybe never. That thought should have frightened me. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. Not because vulnerability had become easy, because it no longer felt like vulnerability. It felt like accuracy, like finally existing without adjusting the edges of myself to fit someone else's understanding. Whether this became something lasting or disappeared tomorrow, one truth had already become impossible to deny. You had quietly altered the way I experienced connection itself. Before you, I believed closeness was measured by time. Now I wasn't so sure. Perhaps closeness isn't counted in years. Perhaps it's measured by how little of yourself you have to translate before someone truly hears you. And if that's true, then something remarkable had already happened. Not because we had spoken endlessly, not because extraordinary moments filled our days, but because somewhere between ordinary conversations and ordinary silence, something extraordinary had learned to exist without ever asking to be named. And the more naturally it existed, the more impossible it became to imagine that it had ever been absent at all.